Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ALS Association 2015 Research Symposium. I'm Karen Galloway, Care Services Director, and it's great to see everyone today. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I just wanted to invite you to please continue to enjoy our refreshments throughout the afternoon. And after our three distinguished guests complete their presentations, they will stay on for a panel question and answer period. So we're looking forward to a great afternoon. And with that said, I'd like to introduce to you our Executive Director, Lance Christian.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you. Let's give her a round of applause for putting all this together. So thank you. And also, thank you to our volunteers in the back who are helping us this morning. Thank you all for being here today. I know many of you, some of you I'm meeting for the first time today. I'm excited to be here and be celebrating this year my 11th year with the ALS Association. And it's been really remarkable as getting to be a longer-term veteran, the progress that we see being made in understanding ALS and moving forward towards a treatment and ultimately a cure. The mission of our organization is to fund and lead with global cutting-edge research for treatment and a cure for ALS while we provide compassionate care and support for families living with this disease. And we focus very much on living with ALS and the practical strategies that you need and supports that you need to maintain independence and pursue the goals that are important to you, including the national anthem. So, it takes me back to grade school. How many teachers do we have here in the audience? So, fair number, all right. So one of the things that is part of our organization is opportunities like this to come together and under the auspices of the ALS Association, create community where you can connect, learn, and make connections with other families living with ALS. And it's exciting here in greeting everyone at the door today. I saw people who were here from Portland, Washington County, down the Willamette Valley, Salem, the Eugene area, Sisters, and all the way from Wallowa County. So kudos to everyone who traveled some distance to be here today. It shows your passion and commitment to this cause. So we're excited to have three great speakers here today, and my main role is going to be to introduce them. And so our first speaker this afternoon is Steve Gibson. He's our Chief Mission Strategy and Public Policy Officer for the ALS Association. And he is a person who I will candidly share that a lot of people don't know from behind the scenes that he's made a huge difference in the lives of all families living with ALS today. He joined the ALS Association in 1997, and under his tenure, he established our public policy program and office in Washington, D.C., and was one of the first people with a grassroots volunteer group going up on the Hill to advocate for ALS. And in his time, funding for ALS, federal funding for ALS has tripled. And he's led the efforts for the creation of the National ALS Registry, as well as the ALS Research Program at the Department of Defense. But some of the things that I always tell Steve I'm most proud of his tenure and his work is the increase in services for families living with ALS that his team and he have led, which includes really Social Security presumptive eligibility so that there's not a long wait for people to get ALS, led the effort to implement the 24-month Medicare waiver so that people can have insurance right away and not have to wait 2 years, as well as, for those of you who are veterans, really championed and led the effort so that our veteran heroes living with ALS could access service-connected benefits. So he really is a hero of our organization, and I want to welcome Steve Gibson to the stage.
Well, thank you, Lance. And this is the first presentation is probably your less scientific. So I hope it's going to be more like a support group for you all, where you can really ask any questions from me about the drug development pipeline and about our public policy program. So I won't be behind the podium. I'll be walking around because sometimes when you're behind that podium, people don't feel as comfortable asking questions. And this really is to be here as a big support group to help you understand what we're doing for the National Association, working with our chapter, as well as what we're doing in public policy and drug development. You know, sometimes I think when people say public policy, it's like, oh, that's politics, and I don't really want to get involved in politics. It's dirty, it's nasty. But hopefully today I'll be able to share with you how important it is for us to use the government to be able to support people with ALS and their families, as well as develop a treatment. I haven't been back for a while to this area, but it's one of my favorite chapters. Lance, I met Lance actually before he was chapter exec. He was the care service person, but also the public policy chair, the advocacy chair, we called it back then. And what I've really admired Lance is about his sense of urgency. Because of this disease, you can't wait till Monday if you get called on a Friday afternoon. You really have to be able to embrace this and really help with families, and I really applaud Lance for always having that sense of urgency. So I'm going to start a little bit about public policy and talk about what it really means in our mission. And I think a lot of people who understand it get the fact that it is something that deals with Congress and the Hill. But the other part that sometimes gets forgotten is the regulatory side, us working with the executive branch of government, the FDA, NIH, et cetera. And that part is so important, CMS, for the care of people with ALS, but the FDA is also a very, very important part of the innovation process. You know, a lot of times people on the Hill, in fact, will say, well, I want all the money going to NIH or DOD, and that's an important part of the process. It's usually the first step of the process, but we also have to make sure we have the resources at FDA to be able to approve the drugs, be able to get the therapies out to patients. Lance kind of highlighted a little bit about the history of the Public Policy Department. It was officially set up in November of '97 when they hired myself. But before that, we had some really great volunteers led by one of our trustees, Ellen Phillips, who really was one of the spearheader of the advocacy efforts. And in fact, she was part of the group that first went to Congress back in 1992 to declare May ALS Awareness Month. I know a lot of times people say, gosh, why do we use May? And that's how it really started from them. Lance briefly mentioned the Medicare 24-month waiting period we passed, and it's something I'm probably most proud of because it's the only time that law has ever been amended. And when I first came on board, I was sort of given a bunch of things to do, and many of the top lobbyists in D.C. are saying, you'll never get that passed. It'll never, ever change. You know, many folks have been trying to change that from the very beginning. Don't waste your time. And it's something that the association decided to really get behind because we saw people with this disease not getting their benefits. And as you all know, the challenges of being diagnosed. And there were many people who would come to Washington and say, I just got my spouse's first check, and unfortunately she passed. So it's something I'm very, very proud of, and I hope that it's helped many, many people in this room. I mentioned our announcement to the registry, which we'll go more into. It's something that will be very, very exciting, not only for developing a treatment, but also finding more about this disease. The Veterans Benefit passed in 2008. It also is very important and special to us. It's the Department of Veterans Administration actually made the service connection, and one of the few times that it actually wasn't tied to a certain campaign or a certain war. And so no matter when you've been diagnosed with ALS, you're eligible to have service connection benefits. And I think that's really important to share because a lot of folks don't know that, because many people a decade ago who lost a loved one who was a veteran don't know that they can today go and apply for benefits. And there's been some great stories of spouses who find out they have this extra income, find out that there's scholarships and available for some of their kids. So, you know, please, 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 if you know of someone like that, connect them with the chapter so they can make sure that those benefits are received. We did have our first FDA hearing for ALS. It was actually the first hearing at the neurological division ever for any disease. And a lot of folks aren't sure why we had that hearing. And it was partly because Congress was working with the FDA and really kind of letting them know that we need to have a different culture on the approval of drugs. And so that happened, and we also were working closely with a drug company named Biogen, who was hopeful to have some really favorable results from phase 3. And so we said, gosh, let's pick a time before you file your new drug application to be able to get in front of the FDA and be able to educate them about ALS. Because as you all know, if you're a person with ALS, you're willing to take different sort of risk than you are a person with arthritis. And I don't mean to belittle that disease, but I think the FDA needs to know that. The benefit-risk ratio is different for people who have this disease. Unfortunately, that company didn't file for a new drug application, but we went ahead anyway and had the hearing, and I'll share with you some of the good things that came out of that hearing in a little bit. And then lastly, we've been able to really increase our research spending, our growth of research at the department closely now to about $1 billion. So as I mentioned how important it is for the care of the disease, many of you probably don't realize, but 85% of all people with ALS are on some type of government program. That's Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, all those things are part of that pie. And of course, there's a 15% that aren't on it, that are on private insurance or other sort of state-type retirement. To show you how our research has grown over the years, it was a little over $10 million back in '98, and here it's close to where we said $1 billion. So that just shows you that the squeaky wheel does get the grease, and that's why it's important to speak out to your members of Congress about the need for things. Now, in comparison to the other sort of researchers out there, it can show you how you basically have other organizations who fund diseases, including the ALS Association. It's really dwarfed by the government. Now, that's not saying, because a lot of people will say, well, if that's the case, why don't we just use all government funding? It's not an either or. In fact, the reason why this is so big is because of the fact that we've had a great research department, public policy department that's been able to leverage those dollars to really grow, and both are really needed. And in fact, those numbers are a little bit old because we haven't included ice bucket dollars there for research. But for people who will really have an interest in research, you should get involved in public policy because that's really an important area that funds many, many research projects. So here's the drug development pipeline, and this is a simplistic version. I am not a scientist. This is kind of a layman's sort of version of that, and hopefully you can begin to understand sort of the complex process that takes, on average, 15 years. And this is a pipeline for every therapy that's out there, not just for ALS, but just to show you how challenging it is and how many initial compounds, you can see here, 10,000, don't make it to the end. And it takes, $1 to about $2 billion. We were using the number about $1.5 billion. A new study came out by Tufts last year that said it's actually closer to $2 billion. But when you're getting up into the billions of dollars, it's not a lot of difference in my understanding of it. But just to kind of show you where we're going on this. It starts left to right. The important part I want to share here, though, is that to help understand what the ALS Association does in terms of its ecosystem, in terms of its mission setting, we are a very unique association that not only does research, not only does care services, but does public policy. And what really kind of hit me during the Ice Bucket Challenge is talking to a lot of my friends and family, like I'm sure yours, all did the Ice Bucket Challenge and wondering where the money would go to. And a lot of people said, well, it has to go to research. And so we would have these discussions and with my friends and family, and like, well, when you say research, what do you mean? Do you want to find how ALS came about? Do you want to find out what the causes are? And most people, if not all, said to me, I really want a treatment. And so it dawned on me that a lot of folks don't understand that you need more than just research to develop a treatment. And that's not saying that a majority of these dollars won't go to research, but it really takes all three parts of this development pipeline to develop a therapy. Because you need the dollars invested in research to be able to look at the compounds. But once you get the compounds a certain part of the pipeline, you have to test them at our centers. You have to test them before people with ALS. And lastly, when it gets to the very end, you need to make sure that you break down those barriers. So the actual company, the actual compound, doesn't have challenges on getting the approval process. So with the ALS Association, we really have an important sort of mission priority of all three of those things, and it's very important. I think it's going to be able to really leverage our ability to develop a treatment. So in looking at this and the importance of drug development for us, we've really taken a look on how we're going to speed up this process. And in fact, all of you should have a bookmark at your table that talks about a few of the things that we can actually speed up the process. I'm going to mention in a moment about our FDA guidance document, which is sort of like the roadmap for drug companies when they bring a treatment through the process. I'll talk briefly about our drug company working group that is actually set up back in 1995. We mentioned the registry, and one of the other things we're doing on Capitol Hill is our Dormant Therapies Act. So those are all things that we think will help increase the process or make it faster for a treatment. Now, going back to the process, how expensive it is. You can see over the number of years how it's really, grown. And when you look at this process, it's important to know that it's not just the actual cost of what the compound is, what they're looking at. It actually is all the failed endeavors, too, that company has looked at. That's all part of the process. And in fact, that's a lot of reason why sometimes the cost of drugs and biologics are much higher than people think. So I mentioned a lot of these things we're working on in terms of how we're pushing things forward. Two things I haven't mentioned before is, one, our ALS research program that really focuses, at the Department of Defense, our preclinical research that helps bring about candidates. And we'll talk about that more in detail because we're really excited to have one of the latest recipients of those funds here with us today. But the last part is the 21st Century Cures Initiative. Has anyone heard about that initiative at all? A couple? Well, that's something that Congress is working on right now. And it's something that Congressman Upton from Michigan and Congresswoman DeGette from Colorado, and they hope to get it passed actually before the summer. And they're looking at a lot of different things to speed the process of research up. Everything from giving NIH more money to changing things at the FDA and hopefully doing things like dormant therapies, which will enable companies to have more shots on goal. So the FDA guidance document. Has anyone heard of that before? Yes. Lance? Okay. In the back? Well, that's good. So it's something that we asked the FDA at our briefing hearing back in February of 2013. And it's a process we've already started. What we're really trying to do is be able to have a roadmap for companies so they don't have to go through the same sort of hurdles, the same sort of barriers that other companies have, talking about surrogate endpoints, talking about what works and what the FDA is looking at. And so we asked the FDA a couple years ago about this. It's something that the Alzheimer's community actually has. It hasn't been closed, hasn't been adopted, but they have a guidance document in progress. And so we went to the FDA and we said, it's really important for us to have one. We actually met with MDA and brought MDA with us up there to show the kind of scope of this. And the FDA said to us, gosh, there's like 9,000 rare diseases. If we do it for you, how can we do it for everybody else? We don't have the bandwidth. So about that time, we actually had some colleagues in the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy area working on Duchenne, and they also went a few months before us and asked for a hearing, or asked for a guidance document, got the same response. So they developed a sort of template that they can get input from a whole bunch of stakeholders, whether you're a clinician, whether you're a patient, whether you're a center, whether you're a company, to come about to bring best practices. And so we were able to, once the ice bucket happened, to appropriate some dollars to be able to get some resources to create this. And it's something that has started and will be completed by next March. That doesn't mean that any therapy that goes before the FDA before next March won't be helped because the FDA is engaged right now. We understand how important it is, and so if a company brings something before the FDA this summer, we've already engaged them. And in fact, I'm not sure if we really shared it with the community at large, but our new president, Barb Newhouse, one of her goals is to really bring the entire ALS community together. And we had a meeting a couple months ago called Collaboration for a Cure of 17 different ALS organizations throughout the country who focus on research, brought them together, and had 4 people from the FDA listening about some of these things. And one of the reasons we brought them together was to get their input on the guidance document, because it's important for the FDA to have a community perspective, not just the one association perspective. So that project has started. And in fact, after our discussion today, if there's anybody in the audience that'd like to be part of it, to sit on that committee up here to help out, you're welcome to, because we want many, many different perspectives of people living with ALS. So any questions about that guidance document? Because I know it's kind of went over real quick. Okay. So here are some other tools that Congress has given the FDA to speed up the process. Back in 1992, FDA kept on explaining about the challenges of approving therapies. And they said, we don't have the resources. So something was developed called Prescription Drug User Fee Act, where Congress has the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry actually get together and say, you know what, we need more resources, here's where we need them, and pharma actually gives additional dollars to the FDA that goes through Congress. So it's not part of the appropriation process, it's a different process. So every 5 years, that's renegotiated, and more dollars go to the FDA so they can have more resources to approve drugs. Some of the things that get attached to those dollars are incentives for folks looking at rare diseases, or unmet needs, as they're sometimes called. One is a priority review that was established back in 1992, and that basically allows a company who's working on an unmet need or a rare disease to not have the 10-month at the FDA period, but it decreases it to 6 months. So it knocks off 4 months of the approval process. FDA, once they get that, the clock starts ticking, and they have to come out with an answer in 6 months, not 10 months. Most recently, the Breakthrough Therapy Act was passed, and that actually is a process that we call all hands on deck. You don't have to wait till the very end to get an answer from the FDA. You can have consultation meetings from the very beginning so you understand as a company where you are. And last but not least is accelerated approval. And it's something that I know has come up recently over one potential therapy out there. It's something that the association wholeheartedly supports. It was actually established back in 1992. It's something that's been tweaked, actually, the last PDUFA that was passed in 2012. And the tweak actually helped speed things up for a lot of various conditions. If you look at cancer, right now, instead of waiting till the very end to find out what the clinical outcomes are within a trial, if you can show a surrogate endpoint, like in cancer, if there's a tumor, if you can show the tumor actually shrinking, that's an endpoint that the FDA will approve to go forward. So if a company files a new drug application and then asks for accelerated approval, they don't have to go through the entire process before the actual drug gets to market. The FDA still reviews it, and in fact, if there's something that comes out later, they can take it off market, but it's something that gives access to patients as soon as those surrogate endpoints and as soon as that new drug application is approved. At the bottom here is something that's part of the process, but actually is a way for people who don't meet eligibility to try new drugs. Sometimes it's called compassionate use. Its technical term is actually expanded access. And it's the ability before a drug is approved for a company to allow some people to try out the drug before it's officially approved. And it's a practice that we as the association wholeheartedly encourage every company to do when they get to that point to be able to do it. So those were a lot of quick things. Any questions about any of those things? Okay. Accelerated approval. So, but the key thing for accelerated approval is you have to, A, have some agreed upon surrogate endpoints. So like for ALS, when I first started back in '98, there was a drug called myotrophin. And that drug, when it was looking for approval, was focused on survival. And we all know, people who deal with ALS, if we had a few more months or years, that would still be helpful. And so we've been able to encourage the FDA through our clinicians to look at the drug development process, look at other things other than survival, like breathing ability, like muscle strength. In fact, if you all heard about the trial for cytokinetics, that's going to go into phase 3, one of their determining surrogate endpoints is increased muscle strength. So those are some of the new ways of looking at therapies to see if they're really effective. So our drug company working group started back in 1995, and it really was one of the creation of Ellen Phillips, who I mentioned briefly, and our president at the time, Mike Havlicek. And they felt, gosh, we have Riluzole that's approved, and there were many other therapies in the pipeline. We know that probably the best way to be able to find many treatments is to have combination testing. So we asked for all the companies to get together at least once a year so they can understand each other, learn from each other, et cetera. Unfortunately, most of those companies back in 98, 99 who were looking at ALS aren't around or have not been involved in ALS, but we still keep the tradition up once a year as part of our American Academy of Neurology meeting, because we really want other researchers to work together. We want the ability, in fact now, most trials that go forward, like that Biogen trial, actually use Riluzole as one of their components on testing. And in fact, one of the good things that came out of the DEX trials showed that Riluzole was probably more effective on some people with ALS than before. So it's our way of bringing the research community together. And in fact, it's not just really a meeting, it's almost like a debate, because you have the top researchers in the country asking a lot of tough questions from their colleagues. You have the top companies in the company viewing and seeing what's going on. So it's a practice that happens annually with our American Academy of Neurology meeting. And in fact, our meeting we had just last month in April, there's an update on our website. And if you need to know where it is, ask myself or my colleague, Mark Murtaugh, in the back there. So there are some upside things for drug development. One is that in the last year, 44 new drugs were approved by the FDA. And almost half of them, over 40%, were for rare diseases. And I know that's not an ALS drug, but it's to show you the culture is changing at the FDA. The pendulum is swinging in a different direction, because a lot of people in Congress and a lot of advocates were really unhappy that there weren't a lot of therapies being approved. Also, the biotech investment has really changed. Our economy has grown, it's gone in a different way, and it's really risen by 29%, so we're really excited about that. So here is a clinical research drug development pipeline, and I'm not sharing it with you so you guys can be really familiar with every phase, but I want to share 3 things about it. One is, this is a traditional pipeline. We at the association are working on things through research, through our companies and through our Fda Guidance Document to perhaps bypass this approach. Because if we can show something works in a phase 2A or a 2B, we don't need a phase 3. And that's a big change on where we talked about 10 years ago. The second thing is, I mentioned that we really support accelerated approval. But we hope that companies won't wait till their phase 2 is over, will actually ask the FDA up here when they file their treatment IND to ask the FDA for accelerated approval. So if there's a challenge with what is a surrogate endpoint that is really important that's approved, we know early on. We're not sitting here at the end of phase 2 saying, well, we're not sure what might work or not. So it's really important that we make those requests and ask early on. Lance? A treatment IND is something the company files before they can test drugs in humans. Yes? Well, the drug will be available right here after phase 2. That's what we're hoping. It'll be approved. This line right here will come over here. So the third part is the green line, and why I'm highlighting it. In the traditional approval process, this is the part where the FDA actually reviews the drug. And for a non-ALS drug, or for a drug that doesn't meet prior review, it takes 10 months. For ALS, because you get prior review, it takes 6 months. So this would be pushed up earlier. And I'm highlighting this because most people think the FDA is holding things up. But the FDA only has a review process, in the case of ALS, for 6 months. So it's, again, to educate you about the process. It's not, to show yay or nay what the FDA is doing. Right now, the FDA does not have anything they're looking at, to my knowledge. And I say to my knowledge because the sort of agreement that goes into effect from a company to the FDA, because of all the patents, protections, et cetera, the rights, it has a lot of confidentiality. And for example, in Biogen, when we were working with Biogen, many folks didn't know we were because we had signed confidentiality agreements with Biogen. So to my knowledge, there's no company that has filed, that is being reviewed right now by the FDA. Okay, any more questions about that? Because I know that kind of, I flew through that. Sure. So great question. Any disease that has a population of under 200,000 is considered a rare disease. And so any disease that files for that, because basically if you are a rare disease, you get extensions on your patent and exclusivity. So they're not ranked at all. At the end of the day, when we looked at all the therapies that were approved, 17 out of the 44 were rare diseases. It's just by a coincidence. And I think what we're trying to show there is that sometimes people say, well, gosh, rare diseases, there are not a lot of folks in the area, and they'll never get an approval. There is actually a change in that. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, if you've been reading the news, a lot of these big patents have been ending. And so what used to be the focus of a blockbuster drug is now being changed to rare diseases. They're the new blockbuster. They have the more potential. And so you'll see a company like Biogen focus on neurodegenerative diseases. They have a condition for MS. They're looking still at ALS. And that's the kind of the area for that. But it's important to point, though, that any condition under 200,000 is considered a rare disease. Yes. Great question. Since I've been here, we have used 30,000 as the number. The ALS, our NIH came out about 4 or 5 years ago and said it was a lot lower, less than 20. CDC came out for their first sort of number, and it was more like 12,000. But that sort of baseline data, that will only grow because as we're learning, many, many people don't know about the registry yet. So, but why that first question was so important is that no matter where that number falls, even if it goes to be 80,000, it's still going to be considered a rare disease. And even if there's only 10,000 people who have the disease, this association is not going to work any less hard. So the numbers might be important when it comes to perhaps looking on service areas as an association, but in terms of finding a therapy, that number is not as important as some of the other things like finding, risk factors and things of that nature that we'll share. Yes? I don't know that answer. In fact, maybe we could ask some of the other folks here who are science. I know that our FDA sometimes is considered more lenient than other companies. The EMU that looks at the European countries for their standards, there's a lot of discussion between researchers in all parts because our research portfolio is not just focused in the U.S., it's worldwide. For ALS, there hasn't really been seen that, but I don't really know that. I know that the EMU is actually working on a guidance document right now as well, and they're a little bit further, and so we're sharing and learning a lot from what they have here. As you know, many companies, look at various models for approval, but and the FDA has looked at a company can use a European trial for submission for the FDA. So I don't have the complete answer to that, but maybe one of our other research folks might know more information about that. Okay, so I'm going to go into the priorities for the association, and these are the ones that are really focused on drug development and research. Our ALS research our registry, we're asking for $10 million. We're asking for another $10 million for our Department of Defense research program, and we want to enact a new therapy that we'll talk in detail about called Dormant Therapies that is really our more incentives for companies to focus on rare diseases or diseases with unmet needs who don't have therapies out there. So how many of you have heard about the ALS Registry? Great. It's something that is very, very important, and in fact, as we travel around, a lot of people come up to us and discuss things like, gosh, I heard about the high incidence of soccer players in Milan who have ALS. I've heard about NFL players who have ALS. What have they derived out of that? Any risk factors? Why do people in the military are twice as likely to have ALS? In fact, there's two studies I get quizzed a lot on. I heard that if you smoke more, you're more likely to have ALS, and if you drink more, you're less likely to have ALS. So all those come about, but they're all studies that focus on a small number of people and not enough for us to say A, B, or C are risk factors. And so the registry will help us be able to answer some of those questions. It was something that we started back in 2004, and this is really the first national ALS registry. There have been registries developed before, some with the company that first established Realizol, but we really wanted an unbiased look. So no matter who you really worked with, MDA, the ALS Association, another small startup, we wanted to be part of an unbiased registry to be able to find answers to some of those questions. And right now, even with just the 12,000 people we have enrolled in it, it's the largest research project ever created. So even the trial that Biogen had a few years ago that was worldwide, that only had about 1,000 people with ALS. This has a lot more. And as I mentioned, it's actually managed by a subset of CDC called ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry. And they're the folks that really know how to do registries. They've done the World Trade Center registry. They understand really epidemiology and why it's so important. And there are many things we're trying to find out through the registry. One is risk factors. It's something that's very important for people. And in fact, there's not a place I have traveled where I have not met at least one person with ALS who has their own theory on how they develop the disease. A certain episode in their life, a certain something they were taking or something. And so that is really important for us to capture. It'll really kind of help us with clinical trials. And when we first started this project, there wasn't one place to go to find services throughout the whole U.S. because we weren't really collaborating well with other organizations. Not we weren't with them, but they didn't want to share with us. And so on the registry website, you can punch in whatever city, whatever town, and you'll find the resources in that area, whether it's part of the ALS Association, whether it's part of Les Turner, or whether it's part of the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And this is how the registry works. It's two-part. One is that on the left-hand side is where the government really comes into. It gathers all the information for people who are enrolled in Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and the VA, and pumps out a number. And of course, all this is possible because of the other advocacy efforts we did. The fact that people are enrolled quickly into Medicare, the fact that people are service connected in the VA, has all helped put that together. Well, that is sort of what I call the national databases that bring everything together. On the right side is our web portal, and it's something that all of you who have not enrolled should enroll, because that is how we really find out more information about each one of you who have ALS. And these numbers then are compared, so there's no duplications. In fact, you don't use your Social Security number, use your last 5 numbers of the Social Security number, and that's how we can redupe that as we go forward. But that together has the amount of people that are actually enrolled in the registry. So partly from government programs and partly from people who self-enroll themselves. Now, of course, the part that's missing are people who are in private insurance who aren't part of the other sort of programs. So that's why it's really important for folks that aren't part of Medicare, that aren't part of these other programs to enroll. It's equally as important that even if you're part of Medicare to enroll, because while we might have you as a statistic, the having disease, we don't know things like have you smoked, have you served in the military, have you had head trauma, et cetera. And that's been really confusing for a lot of people because we've had a lot of folks say, well, why do you need me? Because I'm already enrolled in Medicare. We need you to enroll. So this is what the front page of the website looks like. And we're not going to take any sort of ownership of this because it is a government website that's very confusing, like most government websites, and aren't very people with ALS friendly. So we apologize for that. In fact, we're trying to make more and more suggestions for them to streamline it. And if you have any, please let us know. But once you enroll, you actually see a list of surveys. And a lot of folks go, well, why aren't those surveys named? So I know that survey number 4 talks about smoking. Well, it's not because we want it unbiased. So we want to know also the fact that you didn't smoke as well as you did smoke. We want to know that you didn't serve in the military as well as you did. And so if we had just put the topics, you may or may not go to those topics. So that's why we have an unbiased there. But that's really, the survey is, how it is. And for those of you who haven't enrolled in the registry, you can do this in stages. You can enroll and then come back and do these surveys. Some of these surveys are really easy, yes or no. Some of the surveys, especially have familial questions about people in your family who've had this disease before, take a little bit of time. Question back there? Oh, where it is? Oh, cdc.gov/ALS. cdc.gov, gov/ALS. Yes, definitely. We want you to enroll and then fill out every survey. Here are the surveys that are there. There's 17 various surveys we have right now, and they really kind of are the gamut of all the various theories out there. One of our newest ones is trauma. I mentioned the fact of the NFL, concussions. That's one of the new surveys. The survey that we advocated to really get in was the open-ended question. And that enables you that if you have any theories on how you came down with this disease, you can put that there. And they don't have to be scientific, or they can just be, what you personally feel. I know some men I talked to recently are convinced as soon as they start taking a certain drug for another condition, they get on it. So please put that on there because we'll look at the range of responses and then say, well, if this is becoming a trend, we'll look to add that as a question for the registry. Yes. Unfortunately, the way registries work, it's only from one time going forward. And so, unfortunately, people who have passed cannot be part of it. But as important as you go through and fill some of these questions, no matter how well you've known somebody, some of these questions you might not have the answer to. And it's really funny because I've been with people to help them enroll, whether they weren't computer savvy or they didn't feel comfortable with the internet. And there were questions that one person in particular asked her spouse to leave because they didn't want them to know how much they drank in college. They didn't want them to know how much they smoked. They didn't want them to know they didn't really exercise. So, that's sort of the challenge is that while you think you might know somebody really well, there might be some parts to that person you don't really know the complete history. Sure.
I've never smoked, but I'm a medical marijuana user. So do I smoke or not?
The questioner looking here, I believe, is tobacco. Tobacco, right, yeah. So one of the more exciting things, and again, I kind of glossed over it quickly, but when we met with our research community, we didn't want to just have a database to find out how many people have this disease. We all felt that what was needed was to create a powerful research engine to develop therapies for this disease. And so that's why I think it's important to find out how many folks have it with this number. It's not our primary focus because we need to get treatments out there as soon as possible for people with ALS. And because of that, in fact, we had contemplated partnering with the MS disease for that. Well, they already had a number of therapies at the time, and they really wanted more about the numbers and about some of the risk factors. So we have a separate sort of kind of outreach because we said, you know what, this has to be about ALS because this is so unique. Our challenges are so different than MS. And so partly what we did was we created some of these risk factors questions up there, but we also said, you know what, a lot of the research community, they really want to get more facts about people with the disease. And so we started to have a study to see, do we need to have a biorepository? And the results haven't officially come out, but I can share with you a little bit. It was very positive for these 3 reasons to create this. One is we'll be working with other biorepositories out there. It won't just be kind of in isolation. But the reason why we needed to have an additional component to the registry with the biorepository is all the other biorepositories don't link your history with your tissue sample or your blood sample. So now if you were able to contribute to the biorepository, you would also be able to, as a researcher, look and say, hey, Steve G., here's his samples, but let me go back and find out, did he smoke? Where did he live? Did he live near an iron smelter? What were his experiences in sports? Did he have a lot of concussions? So for the first time ever, Epidam will be linked with actual blood and tissue. The second thing is that while we knew that there are other biorepositories out there, the challenge was that if you live in a rural area, or not actually a rural area, an area that wasn't one of our centers, you weren't part of that. Because it's really challenging to visit those centers and to be able to donate. And so this will now be a nationally representative biorepository that will have people throughout the entire country. So we can really look at, are there hotspots and why is that? And lastly, this will be a patient user-friendly biorepository. So if you want to be able to donate something, a medical professional will come out to you and get that sample. You won't have to worry about donating it yourself. So that's really key. Now, before I go on to our last thing, one of the things that's really changing the paradigm for clinical trials, and I know a lot of people find out about clinical trials when they go to the center, and then we have a lot of great centers. Some folks who aren't around centers, they have to rely on something called clinicaltrials.gov. Has anyone ever used that? A little bit? How was your experience? Tough. Yeah, and we've heard everything about how to figure out the area, whether you meet the requirements, et cetera. So we're changing all that by having a clinical trial locator on the registry. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, this basically will just let you know if you qualify for the trial. If you check the box and say you want to participate and you fit the criteria, so now instead of just saying here's a trial open for all people with ALS, and perhaps the researcher is really focusing on women over 50 who've never smoked. We don't want you to have to go through that process and then find out you don't qualify. If you qualify and if you've answered those questions, they'll be sending you an email to say, hey, you have this opportunity. If you'd like to participate, you can. And you can see some of the researchers here. One of the first one, Dr. Strickler out of South Carolina, his trial that took months to usually fill up took weeks. And so it's really changing the paradigm for clinical trial enrollment. And we have now, I think there's like 15 or so folks, but more and more people are really using it. In fact, Biogen has just agreed for their next trial to use this sort of notification tool. So the registry also funds research throughout the entire country for some of the top researchers, Dr. Feldman in Michigan. I think one of the first ones I passed over, Dr. Weisskopf, he's doing another study about the connection between ALS and the military. We need to have more information. Yes, ma'am. Well, yeah. So if they're doing a clinical trial and they go through the CDC IRB, this is a legit trial, and you qualify for that trial, you will get an email that says you're able to participate. So it doesn't matter. Right. Now, there could be some requirements that say you have to be living around a center that tests your blood, but as science develops, we're hoping that some of that might change too. But you're exactly right. It's not going to be based on your center. You'll be eligible for that trial, and then if there is some location issue that if you're willing to move, you can do that. So real quick, that's how to enroll in the registry. The last thing I really wanted to highlight was our ALS research program at the Department of Defense. It's something that has really helped with the drug development pipeline, primarily because most of the compounds that don't make it from here to here to preclinical don't because of the support and funding. Biotech companies don't usually want to fund this kind of research because it's very risky. It hasn't really been proven. And so back in 2007, we went to the Department of Defense and said, you know what? There is a connection between ALS and the military. The VA is looking at establishing back then a service connection. It's really important that you add ALS to that list. And we were able to do that. And it basically now over 8 years gave us $54.5 million. It's for any researcher in the country to apply. They don't have to be affiliated with the association. We hope more and more new researchers will apply to be able to be given funding to go forward. It's created actually 4 new drug candidates, which is very, very exciting that now companies are looking at to support to go for future drug development. And again, I think a lot of people, they'll get confused. They think that, oh, well, this is Department of Defense, so this is only okay if you're in the military. No, actually, this research that's being done are for therapies for everybody. So if something is developed, it'll be in the market for everyone to try. And those are some things I just went over. We all know about the connection to the military, the importance of there's been 34 research projects funded, 4 have turned into treatments, and in fact, our latest 2 right here, and we'll hear from one person today on that. So we're very, very proud about that. Lastly, just want to tell you, there's something that's called Dormant Therapy Act that is for diseases that don't have an effective therapy out there. There's a legislation that will give basically companies more shots on goal. Perhaps the patent has worn out, something that will give 15 years of exclusivity for a compound that has been sitting on the shelf that will form a new class of drugs. And we're looking to include that in the 21st Century Cures Act and, if not, pass a bill by itself. And that's the people who are supporting it. Okay, and if you'd like to get more involved in advocacy, Mark and I will be here the entire program, but please feel free to fill out the form to be an ALSA advocate. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Steve. Very informative, and I see how you keep busy. So for all our speakers here today, we will have a panel at the end where you can ask more questions, but also after we close, I'm sure if you want to come up and approach and ask one-on-one questions, they're all happy to do that, time allowing. So quick technical question. Are we launching your presentation, Kim? Okay. So